Looking for a job as a temporary contractor, she walked into the naval base wearing an old, worn uniform that made everyone laugh. The sergeant publicly humiliated her, calling her a walking museum piece. Until the Admiral arrived and saw the classified patch on her sleeve. What happened next shocked everyone who had mocked her. Hit like if you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more incredible military stories, and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Hangar 3B as Lydia Marston stepped through the reinforced doors, her worn maintenance uniform drawing immediate attention. The fabric had seen better days, sleeves frayed at the edges, colors faded from countless washes, the kind of outfit that belonged in a supply depot, not a classified aircraft inspection facility. Her footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as she moved between the towering experimental aircraft, each one draped in partial coverings that hinted at technologies she wasn't cleared to see. The hangar buzzed with morning activity, technicians calibrating instruments, engineers reviewing digital tablets, mechanics fine-tuning components with surgical precision. That's when Sergeant Travis Heller noticed her. He stood near a diagnostic station, clipboard in hand, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the methodical attention of someone who'd made authority his religion. When his gaze landed on Lydia, his expression shifted from routine surveillance to barely concealed amusement. "Hold up there," Heller called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. "You lost or something?" The surrounding activity slowed. Conversations quieted, tools paused mid-motion as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Lydia stopped walking, her shoulders instinctively drawing inward as she felt the weight of multiple stares. "I'm here for the equipment inspection," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Temporary maintenance contract," Heller approached with the swagger of someone who enjoyed having an audience. Behind him, soldiers and technicians began forming a loose semicircle, drawn by the prospect of entertainment in what was otherwise a routine morning. "This is serious," Heller's voice rose deliberately, ensuring everyone could hear. "You came to work looking like that?" He gestured at her uniform with theatrical disgust. "What is this? A piece from the base museum? Did they run out of actual work clothes and decide to send us a walking antique?" Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Someone whispered something that caused more chuckling. Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks as she adjusted her sleeve, a nervous gesture that inadvertently revealed a glimpse of something sewn into the fabric's interior. The movement was quick, barely perceptible, but for half a second the edge of a faded patch became visible. "Look, ma'am," Heller continued, his tone shifting to mock helpfulness. "I don't know who told you this was appropriate, but we've got standards here. This isn't some civilian garage where anything goes." Lydia's breathing shortened. She could feel phones being discreetly positioned, recording the humiliation for later entertainment. Her access badge, clipped to her belt, blinked with an error message, a detail that would prove significant later, though no one paid attention to it now. "Maybe you should head back to wherever they issued you that costume," Heller suggested, "and tell them to find you something from this century." The crowd's amusement grew. A few soldiers exchanged knowing glances, already composing the story they'd share later, but Lydia remained standing, her head bowed but her feet planted firmly on the hangar floor. "I have authorization," she said simply. "Authorization," Heller laughed. "For what? A historical reenactment?" As the mockery continued, none of them noticed the way Lydia's eyes automatically scanned the hangar's exits, cataloging distances and egress routes with the unconscious precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such assessments. None of them saw how her hands, despite their trembling, moved with familiar confidence whenever they brushed against the nearby equipment, and certainly none of them understood the significance of that brief flash of fabric, the patch that bore a symbol most of them had never seen. From a unit that officially had never existed, the laughter echoed off the hangar walls as Lydia stood in the center of it all, bearing their judgment with the quiet endurance of someone who had weathered far worse storms than the cruelty of strangers. But storms, as any sailor knows, have a way of changing direction without warning. The tool room attached to Hangar 3B hummed with the low vibration of ventilation systems and distant aircraft engines. Lydia found herself there an hour later, organizing maintenance equipment with the methodical precision of someone who needed the work to keep her hands busy and her mind focused. She lifted a torque wrench, feeling its weight, testing its calibration with practiced fingers. The movement was smooth, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that spoke of years spent with such tools, yet she worked with her shoulders curved inward, making herself smaller in the space as if trying to become invisible. Through the tool room's window, she could see soldiers passing in the corridor beyond. Some glanced in her direction with lingering amusement from the morning's entertainment. Others simply ignored her presence entirely, which somehow felt worse than their mockery. A group of 3 technicians walked by, their conversation clearly audible through the thin walls. "Did you see that uniform? Where did they even find her? Probably some budget contractor. They'll hire anyone these days. I give her until lunch before Heller finds another reason to send her home." Their laughter faded down the corridor, leaving Lydia alone with the steady hum of machinery and her own controlled breathing. She set down the wrench and opened her small canvas bag, retrieving what appeared to be a metal coin. The object caught the fluorescent light as she turned it in her palm. Old brass or bronze, worn smooth at the edges, bearing an intricate symbol that seemed somehow official yet unfamiliar. The symbol showed interlocking geometric patterns surrounding what might have been a stylized communication tower or antenna array. Around the edge, barely legible text read "Vanguard Relay." She held the coin for a moment, her thumb tracing the ray's design, then returned it to her bag with careful reverence. The gesture was automatic, unconscious, like a talisman carried by someone who had learned to take comfort in small rituals. A sound in the corridor made her look up sharply, her head turning with the instant alertness of someone whose reflexes had been honed by situations where a moment's inattention could prove fatal. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable, too sharp, too focused for a civilian contractor. When she realized it was just a maintenance cart being wheeled past, she forced herself to relax, but the momentary slip had revealed something. Beneath the nervous civilian exterior lived someone whose body remembered military protocols. Even if her mind tried to suppress them, she resumed organizing tools, but her movements carried an efficiency that spoke of familiarity with military equipment far beyond what any temporary contractor should possess. Her hands knew these spaces. The way she moved through the tool room suggested someone who had worked in similar environments before, someone who understood not just the tools themselves but the systems they served. Yet when another group of soldiers passed, laughing about something unrelated, she instinctively hunched her shoulders again, retreating into the protective shell of insignificance she'd carefully constructed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the contradiction she embodied. A woman who moved through military space like she belonged there, yet carried herself as if she were perpetually apologizing for her presence. In her bag, the Vanguard relay coin rested silently, bearing witness to a history that its owner had buried so deeply that even she sometimes forgot it existed. The administrative area adjacent to Hangar 3B buzzed with the controlled chaos of military bureaucracy. Digital terminals glowed with security protocols, access logs, and personnel databases that hummed quietly in climate-controlled efficiency. Sergeant Heller stood at one such terminal, his expression shifting from amusement to genuine irritation as error messages cascaded across the screen. He'd been trying to process Lydia's entry into the base systems for 20 minutes, and each attempt yielded the same result. Access restricted. Authorization required. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, jabbing at the keyboard with increasing force. Around him, other personnel went about their business, but several had begun to notice his growing frustration. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Lydia's arrival. She'd been summoned from the tool room, still carrying the careful posture of someone who expected more humiliation. Behind her, a small crowd began to gather. Word had spread about the morning's entertainment, and people were hoping for an encore. "Your paperwork is messed up," Heller announced without looking up from the screen. "The system won't accept your credentials. Either someone made a serious error, or—" He turned to face her, his expression calculating. "You're using someone else's identity." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Conversations in nearby workstations quieted as people leaned in to listen. Lydia felt the familiar weight of judgment settling around her shoulders. "That's not possible," she said quietly. "I have all the proper documentation." "Do you?" Heller's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who thought they'd found the smoking gun. "Because this system is telling me that your access level requires clearances you definitely don't have. So here's what I'm thinking. Maybe you borrowed someone's credentials. Maybe you thought you could slip through on paperwork that wasn't meant for you." He gestured to the gathered crowd with theatrical flair. "It happens more than you'd think. People desperate for work trying to use documentation that doesn't belong to them." Whispers rippled through the audience. Lydia could feel their eyes dissecting her, analyzing every detail of her appearance for signs of deception. "I'm going to make this easy for you," Heller continued, his voice taking on the mock kindness of someone offering mercy. "Just admit you made a mistake. Tell me you used someone else's paperwork to get this contract, and I'll let you walk out of here without calling security. Clean slate, no charges." The offer sounded reasonable to the observers. Magnanimous even. Several people nodded approvingly at Heller's apparent generosity, but Lydia remained silent, her hands clasped in front of her, her breathing controlled. "I am who I say I am," she said finally. "Are you?" Heller leaned against the terminal, enjoying his position of power. "Because the evidence suggests otherwise." From across the administrative area, Evan Porter had been watching the scene unfold. A 20-year veteran of base operations, Porter had seen enough personnel issues to recognize when something didn't add up, but what struck him wasn't Lydia's alleged deception. It was her posture. Despite her obvious discomfort, despite the public humiliation, she stood with her feet positioned in a slight modified attention stance. Her breathing was controlled, measured. Her eyes, while downcast, periodically swept the room in systematic patterns that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with situational awareness. Porter had seen that kind of bearing before, and not among civilian contractors. He moved closer, ostensibly checking his own terminal, but actually studying the woman everyone assumed was a fraud. Something about her triggered a memory he couldn't quite place, a recognition that hovered just beyond conscious recall. "Last chance," Heller announced. "Make this easy on everyone." Lydia raised her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. "No," she said simply. The word carried a quiet authority that surprised everyone, including herself. For just a moment the mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath, a steel that had been forged in circumstances none of them could imagine. Porter felt the memory sharpen, like a photograph coming into focus, but he said nothing, merely watched, waiting for pieces to fall into place. The diagnostic panel room hummed with the complex symphony of electronic equipment monitoring aircraft systems throughout the base. Banks of screens displayed telemetry data, structural stress readings, and communication protocols in an endless stream of real-time information. Lydia stood before one such panel, her civilian contractor clearance allowing her access to basic maintenance diagnostics. She reached up to adjust a display setting, her movement causing her sleeve to ride up several inches. For the first time since her arrival, the interior of her uniform became fully visible, and with it, the patch that had been hidden beneath the fabric. The patch was faded but unmistakable, a circular insignia featuring interlocking geometric patterns surrounding a stylized communication array. Around its border, barely legible text read Vanguard Relay, with smaller designation numbers below. The fabric around it had been carefully reinforced, suggesting it had been sewn on with precision and worn with pride. Evan Porter, who had been troubleshooting a nearby terminal, caught sight of the patch from the corner of his eye. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His body went rigid, his breath caught audibly, and his hand froze over his keyboard. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible over the electronic humming. He stared at the patch for several seconds, his mind racing through military databases he'd accumulated over 2 decades of service. Vanguard Relay was a designation he'd heard whispered in classified briefings, referenced in documents with security classifications so high they were printed on paper that would self-destruct if removed from secure facilities. The unit had been dissolved years ago after a mission that was simultaneously considered a massive success and a catastrophic failure, depending on which classified report you had access to. Personnel files had been sealed, participants scattered to other assignments or discharged entirely, and the program itself had been buried so deeply that most people who worked in military communications had never heard of it. But Porter had heard of it. He'd been peripherally involved in some of the technical support systems, and he remembered the aftermath, the way certain communications protocols had suddenly changed, the way some very experienced personnel had simply vanished from active duty without explanation. Lydia lowered her arm, the patch disappearing back beneath the worn fabric of her sleeve. She seemed unaware that she'd been observed, continuing her work with the same careful efficiency she'd displayed all morning. Porter quietly signaled to a junior technician nearby. "Hey Martinez," he said, his voice carefully casual. "Go pull the CR Delta file from Secured Archives priority request. CR Delta, I've never heard of. Just do it. And if the system asks for authorization, tell them it's for operational verification. I'll take responsibility." Martinez nodded and headed for the secure terminal access point. Porter turned back to watch Lydia, who was now reviewing system diagnostics with the kind of focused competence that suggested she understood these systems far better than any temporary contractor should, across the diagnostic room. Sergeant Heller had been observing the morning's activities with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed being proven right, but he'd also noticed the sudden tension in Porter's posture, the way the veteran technician had sent someone on what appeared to be an urgent errand. Something was happening, and Heller's instincts told him it related to the woman he'd been systematically humiliating. His expression shifted from smug satisfaction to something more predatory. If there were developments he wasn't aware of, he intended to control them. Porter stared at the spot where the patch had been, his mind working through implications and possibilities. In his 20 years of service, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and everything about Lydia's bearing suggested someone with far more military experience than her paperwork indicated. If he was right about what that patch meant, then they'd all been making a very serious mistake. The secured records area occupied a climate-controlled section of the base's administrative complex, where classified files resided in both digital and physical form. Martinez stood before a terminal that required multiple authentication steps, his expression growing increasingly confused as he navigated through security protocols that seemed designed to discourage access. "File designation CR Delta," he typed into the search field. The response was immediate and unambiguous. "Access denied. Flag level authorization required." A red warning box appeared on the screen. "Requested file contains personnel information requiring clearance level Admiral or above. Contact Command Authority for review." Martinez stared at the screen, his understanding of the situation shifting dramatically. He'd expected to find a standard personnel file, perhaps with some minor security classification. Instead, he'd encountered the kind of restriction typically reserved for information that could affect national security. Meanwhile, in the diagnostic room, Porter waited with growing tension. The longer Martinez took, the more certain he became that his suspicions were correct. Vanguard relay personnel wouldn't have standard files. Their documentation would be buried under layers of classification that required extraordinary authorization to access. He made a decision that would change everything. Moving to a secure communication station, Porter placed a call that bypassed normal base protocol entirely. The number he dialed connected directly to Command Authority, specifically to the office of the senior officer responsible for experimental communications programs. "This is Porter, Base Operations," he said when the call connected. "I need to request immediate presence of Command Authority for personnel verification, possible Vanguard relay identification." The voice on the other end sharpened immediately. "Repeat that classification. Vanguard relay, visual confirmation of unit insignia. Personnel currently on base under civilian contractor status." A pause. "Stand by for command response. Do not take any action until authority arrives." The call ended, leaving Porter staring at the handset. In 30 years of military communication, he'd never made a call that generated such an immediate and serious response. In the outer area, Heller had grown impatient with the morning's developments. He'd watched Porter make what appeared to be an urgent call, seen Martinez return from the records area looking pale and confused, and felt the subtle shift in atmosphere that suggested something significant was happening beyond his control. He decided to reassert his authority. "Marston," he called out, his voice carrying across the diagnostic area. "We need to resolve this paperwork issue now." Lydia looked up from the panel she'd been working on, her expression patient despite the continued harassment. "I've been thinking about your situation," Heller continued, approaching with the same theatrical swagger he'd displayed all morning. "And I've decided to give you one final opportunity to make this right." A small crowd began gathering again, drawn by the prospect of another confrontation. But this time the energy felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with entertainment, and everything to do with the growing sense that they were missing crucial information. Either you confess that you've used someone else's credentials to gain access to this facility, Heller announced, or I call security and have you arrested for identity fraud and attempted infiltration of a secure military installation. The accusation was serious enough to make several observers step back. Identity fraud on a military base carried federal charges, and attempted infiltration could be considered an act of espionage depending on the circumstances. Lydia remained silent, her breathing steady, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that was becoming increasingly familiar to Porter, the stance of someone who had learned to endure interrogation without breaking. 5 minutes, Heller said, checking his watch. Then I make the call. The tension in Hangar 3B reached a crescendo as personnel gathered in an irregular formation around the central diagnostic area. What had begun as casual entertainment had evolved into something more serious: accusations of federal crimes, emergency calls to command authority, and the growing realization that they were dealing with something far beyond a simple paperwork error. Sergeant Heller stood at the center of it all, his authority unchallenged and his deadline approaching. He'd given Lydia 5 minutes to confess, and those minutes were now expiring with mathematical precision. "Time's up," he announced, reaching for his communication device. "I'm calling security." That's when they heard it, the sound that every military installation recognizes instantly, the measured cadence of polished dress shoes striking concrete with the authority of high command. The sound echoed from the main entrance corridor, growing louder and more deliberate with each step. Conversations stopped. Personnel instinctively straightened. Even Heller paused, his hand hovering over his communication device as he tried to identify the source of the footsteps. The hangar doors opened, and Admiral Rowan Maddox entered with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect across multiple decades of military service. His uniform was immaculate, his posture erect, and his presence immediately dominated the space in a way that required no announcement or introduction. Behind him, 2 junior officers followed at a respectful distance, their expressions suggesting they understood the gravity of whatever situation had summoned their commanding officer to what should have been a routine maintenance facility. Heller snapped to attention automatically, his body responding to years of conditioning before his mind could fully process what was happening. Around him, other personnel followed suit, creating an impromptu formation that transformed the casual gathering into something resembling a military inspection. "Sergeant," Maddox said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding personnel authorization." "Sir." "Yes, sir," Heller responded, though confusion was evident in his voice. "We have a civilian contractor whose documentation appears to be fraudulent. I was about to contact security for—" Maddox's gaze had already moved past Heller, scanning the assembled personnel with the systematic attention of someone looking for a specific individual. His eyes passed over technicians, mechanics, and administrative staff before settling on a figure standing slightly apart from the main group. Lydia Marston stood near the diagnostic panels where she'd been working, her posture respectful, but not military, her appearance still marked by the worn uniform that had generated so much ridicule. But when Maddox's eyes found her, his entire demeanor changed. He stopped walking, his breathing paused. For several seconds, he simply stared at her with an expression of recognition so profound that it bordered on shock. "Marston," he said finally, the word barely above a whisper, "I thought you had disappeared." The hangar fell into absolute silence. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, though none of them could comprehend what it meant. Lydia's eyes met the Admiral's, and for the first time since her arrival, her carefully maintained civilian posture began to shift. "Sir," she said simply, the word carrying layers of history that only the 2 of them could interpret. Maddox approached slowly, his attention entirely focused on the woman who had been dismissed as a fraud just minutes earlier. When he was close enough to see the details of her uniform, he gestured toward her sleeve. "May I?" he asked. Lydia nodded and raised her arm, allowing the Admiral to examine the patch that had been hidden beneath the worn fabric. When he saw the Vanguard relay insignia, his expression completed its transformation from surprise to something approaching reverence. "The last time I saw this symbol," he said, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear, was before the dissolution of the most classified communications unit in modern military history. He turned to address the assembled personnel, his authority absolute, and his words carrying the weight of official declaration. This woman is not a fraudulent contractor. She is former communications specialist Lydia Marston, and her service record is classified at levels that require my personal authorization to access. The revelation hit the gathered crowd like a physical force. Heller's expression shifted from confident authority to dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of his error. The secondary briefing room adjacent to Hangar 3B had been designed for classified discussions, its reinforced walls and electronic countermeasures ensuring that sensitive conversations remained secure. Admiral Maddox had cleared the space of all personnel, except those directly involved in the morning's incident, creating an atmosphere of official gravity that left no doubt about the seriousness of what was unfolding. Sergeant Heller stood at attention before the Admiral's temporary desk. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Behind him, several witnesses from the morning's events waited in uncomfortable silence, while Lydia sat in a chair positioned to the side, no longer the target of scrutiny but not yet fully vindicated. "Sergeant Heller," Maddox began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of official inquiry, "explain to me, in detail, the basis for your treatment of this woman." Heller's throat worked silently for several seconds before he could produce words. "Sir, Her uniform appeared non-regulation. Her documentation showed irregularities in the system. I believed she was attempting to gain unauthorized access using fraudulent credentials." "I see." Maddox opened a manila folder that had been delivered by one of his assistants. "And what experience do you have in identifying personnel from classified programs?" "Sir, none, sir." "What training have you received in recognizing obsolete unit insignia from experimental programs?" "None." "Sir," Maddox removed a document from the folder, an official memorandum bearing multiple classification stamps and security markings. "This is the authorization for Ms. Marston's presence on this base. It was issued 3 days ago, signed by my office and processed through channels that require clearances significantly higher than your pay grade." He held up the document so that Heller and the other witnesses could see the official seals and signatures. "The paperwork irregularities you observed were not evidence of fraud. They were security protocols, designed to protect the identity of personnel whose service records cannot be accessed through normal channels." The weight of his mistake settled on Heller's shoulders like physical pressure. Around the room, other personnel who had participated in or observed the morning's humiliation began to understand the true scope of their error. "Furthermore," Maddox continued, "I have here a partial summary of Mrs. Marston's service record, the portions that have been cleared for limited disclosure." He opened the folder wider, revealing pages of official documentation. Communications specialist Marston developed the redundant telemetry protocol that saved 3 ships and 47 lives during the classified incident known as Operation Mirror Fall. Her contribution was essential to mission success and was recognized at the highest levels of command. The silence in the room had become oppressive. Every person present understood they had witnessed and participated in the public humiliation of someone whose service deserved respect, not ridicule. The Vanguard relay program was dissolved due to the psychological toll it placed on personnel, not due to any failure of performance, Maddox explained. Participants were offered alternative assignments or honorable discharge with full benefits. Mrs. Marston chose to step away from military service after her experience with operations that I am not authorized to describe in detail. He closed the folder and fixed Heller with a stare that had withered more experienced officers than the sergeant. "Your behavior this morning constituted not just a failure of military courtesy, but a public humiliation of a veteran whose service record exceeds that of anyone in this room." Heller's face had drained of color. "Sir, I apologize. I had no way of knowing." "You had no way of knowing because you made no effort to verify information before rendering judgment," Maddox interrupted. "You assumed incompetence rather than investigating competence. You chose mockery over inquiry." The Admiral stood, his presence filling the room with authority. "You will issue a public apology to Mrs. Marston, in front of the same personnel who witnessed your accusations. You will then report to your commanding officer for remedial training in personnel procedures and military courtesy." "Yes, sir." Maddox turned to the other witnesses. The events you observed this morning are a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, particularly in an environment where people's backgrounds may not be immediately apparent. I expect this lesson to be remembered. He looked at Lydia, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Ms. Marston, I apologize on behalf of this command for the treatment you received. Your service deserved better recognition. The outdoor assembly area between hangars 3B and 4A had been hastily organized into something resembling a formal gathering. Word of the morning's revelations had spread through the base with the speed of military gossip, and personnel from multiple units had found reasons to be present for what everyone understood would be an unprecedented public vindication. Admiral Maddox stood before the assembled group, a leather portfolio in his hands containing documents that bore classification levels most of the observers had never seen. Behind him, Lydia waited with the patient bearing of someone who had learned to endure public attention without seeking it. To one side, Sergeant Heller stood at rigid attention, his earlier swagger replaced by the posture of someone dreading what was to come. Personnel of Naval Air Station Kingsport, Maddox began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly area. This morning's events have provided an important lesson in the dangers of making judgments without complete information. He opened the portfolio and removed a photograph, a group shot of personnel in specialized communications gear, their faces young and serious, taken in what appeared to be a classified facility years earlier. The woman you knew as a temporary civilian contractor is actually former communications specialist Lydia Marston, veteran of operations that remain classified to this day. Her service record includes commendations at levels that require special authorization even to mention. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people processed the transformation of their morning's entertainment into something far more serious. Maddox continued, "The uniform that was mocked for being outdated was issued by a program that operated under security protocols requiring personnel to maintain cover identities even years after their service ended. The museum piece you ridiculed was worn by someone whose technical innovations saved lives in circumstances I cannot describe." He held up another document, this one bearing the seal of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "I am authorized to share only limited details of Specialist Marston's contributions, but those details include the development of communication redundancy protocols that prevented a catastrophic failure during a critical operation. Her work directly resulted in the successful completion of a mission that protected national security interests." The crowd had grown completely still. Even routine base activities seemed to have paused as the weight of the Admiral's words settled over everyone present. "Sergeant Heller," Maddox said, turning toward the man who had initiated the morning's events, "you have something to say." Heller stepped forward, his movements stiff with embarrassment and military discipline. He faced Lydia directly, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. "Ma'am, I owe you a sincere and public apology. I judged you based on appearances without making any effort to understand who you were or what you had contributed to our service. I was wrong to mock your uniform, wrong to question your credentials, and wrong to treat you with disrespect. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air for several seconds before someone in the crowd began to applaud. The sound started slowly, just a few hands clapping, but it grew steadily as more personnel joined in until the entire assembly was offering sustained applause. Lydia stood quietly during the ovation, her expression revealing nothing of what she felt. When the applause finally faded, Admiral Maddox addressed her directly. "Specialist Marston, on behalf of this command, and in recognition of service that has gone too long without proper acknowledgement, I want to thank you for your contributions to our nation's security." He closed the portfolio and looked out over the assembled personnel. "Let this morning serve as a reminder that the person standing next to you may have a history you cannot imagine, and service you cannot comprehend. Military courtesy exists not just for those whose ranks you can see, but for everyone who has earned the right to wear any version of our uniform." The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations starting in hushed tones as people processed what they had witnessed, but many lingered, stealing glances at the woman who had been transformed in their eyes from object of ridicule to recipient of official recognition. Lydia remained standing in the assembly area, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but still carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that true strength didn't require an audience to validate it. The observation deck of the base's administrative building provided a panoramic view of the harbor, where Navy ships rested at anchor like sleeping giants. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, creating patterns of light and dark that shifted with the gentle movement of the waves. Seabirds wheeled overhead in lazy circles, their cries mixing with the distant sounds of harbor operations, engines humming, metal clanging against metal, the steady rhythm of a military installation that never truly slept. Lydia stood at the railing, alone for the first time since the morning's revelations. The emotional weight of the day's events had finally caught up with her. She found herself struggling to process the transformation from invisible contractor to publicly acknowledged veteran. Her hands gripped the metal railing with unconscious intensity, knuckles white against the painted steel, as if anchoring herself to something solid while her internal world shifted beneath her feet. The salt air carried scents that triggered memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. Diesel fuel and metal polish, the ozone smell of electronic equipment, the distinctive blend of sea spray and industrial purpose that defined naval installations around the world. Each breath brought back fragments of her former life. Briefing rooms filled with classified charts, communication centers humming with encrypted traffic, the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that lives depended on the accuracy of her calculations. Footsteps on the deck behind her announced Admiral Maddox's arrival. He approached quietly, respecting the contemplative mood of the moment, his polished shoes making soft clicking sounds against the non-slip surface. When he joined her at the railing, she could sense his presence without turning. The way he positioned himself just beyond her peripheral vision, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid crowding her emotional space. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching harbor activities continue in the distance. A supply boat moved between anchored destroyers, its wake creating expanding V patterns that caught the afternoon light. Personnel conducted routine maintenance on deck equipment, their small figures visible as they moved with practiced efficiency around weapon systems and communication arrays. The endless rhythm of military life continued regardless of individual dramas, a reminder that personal stories, no matter how significant to those living them, existed within larger contexts that demanded constant vigilance. "I owe you an apology as well," Maddox said finally, his voice carrying across the water-scented air, with the careful modulation of someone who had practiced difficult conversations. "Not for this morning. That wasn't my responsibility. But for what happened before, for what led you to walk away from service entirely." Lydia's hands tightened slightly on the railing, her breathing becoming more controlled as his words touched the carefully sealed compartments where she stored memories of her final months in uniform. The metal warmed under her palms, conducting heat from her body back to her awareness, grounding her in the present moment even as the past threatened to surface. "The Vanguard relay program pushed people beyond reasonable limits," he continued, his own gaze fixed on the harbor, as if addressing the ships rather than the woman beside him. "We asked for innovations under impossible time constraints, demanded performance in situations where failure would cost lives, and then acted surprised when the psychological toll became unbearable." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with the authority of someone high enough in the command structure to acknowledge systemic failures without worrying about career repercussions. A boat horn sounded in the distance, its low note carrying across the water like a memorial bell, punctuating his words with the kind of solemn resonance that made difficult truths impossible to ignore. "I've carried guilt about that program for years," Maddox admitted, his voice taking on a more personal quality as he moved from official acknowledgement to individual confession, "about the people we lost to burnout, about the careers we ended in the name of operational necessity, about brilliant minds like yours, that we drove away because we couldn't figure out how to protect them from the pressure we created." Lydia finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable but attentive. In her eyes he could see the evidence of experiences that had aged her beyond her chronological years, the 1,000-yard stare that came from processing information that carried life or death consequences, the careful emotional distance that developed when failure meant more than professional disappointment. "I know why you left," he said, meeting her gaze directly for the first time since joining her at the railing. "After Mirrorfall, after the debriefings and the classified hearings and the weight of knowing that lives hung on calculations you'd made under impossible circumstances, The success was classified. The recognition was limited, but the responsibility was absolute. "I know why you couldn't stay." She nodded slowly, the first acknowledgement that his words were reaching something inside her carefully constructed defenses. The gesture was minimal, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of years of suppressed emotion finally finding a witness who understood the true cost of classified service. "The offer I'm about to make comes with a promise," Maddox continued, his voice taking on the formal cadence of someone making an official commitment. "If you're willing to consider returning to service, not full-time, not under the pressures that drove you away before, but as a consultant on projects that match your skills, I guarantee that you'll work under conditions that prioritize your well-being as much as operational requirements." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small metal object, a commemorative coin bearing the same Vanguard relay insignia that was sewn into her uniform, but polished and new, its surface reflecting the afternoon light like a small mirror. The coin's weight was substantial, crafted from actual silver rather than the aluminum alloys used for standard military commemoratives, and its edges bore inscriptions that detailed specific operational contributions in language cleared for official recognition. "This represents acknowledgement of what you contributed," he said, offering it to her with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting a medal. "Not just the technical innovations, but the personal cost you paid to develop them, the sleepless nights, the constant pressure, the knowledge that error meant catastrophe. All of it is recognized here." Lydia accepted the coin with both hands, holding it with the same careful reverence she'd shown the worn coin from her bag. The metal was warm from his pocket, and its surface bore engravings so fine they required close examination to read completely. For the first time since the morning's events began, tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, not from humiliation or embarrassment, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen for who she actually was, rather than who others assumed her to be. "I'm not asking for an answer today," Maddox said gently, his voice returning to the personal register of someone speaking as an individual rather than as a representative of institutional authority. "Take time to consider whether there's a place in your life for this kind of service again, but know that if you decide to return, you'll be coming back to a command that understands your value and respects your limitations." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the sounds of evening shift changes across the water. Lights began to appear on ships as day watch handed responsibilities to night watch, creating points of illumination that would guide harbor traffic through the darkness. The sight reminded Lydia of the communication networks she'd once designed, systems that remained invisible until they were needed, then became the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. They returned to their contemplation of the harbor, but the silence now carried possibilities instead of endings. In her hand, the new coin caught the fading sunlight, transforming recognition long delayed into the foundation for whatever might come next. The weight of it felt different from her old coin, not heavier in substance but heavier in meaning, carrying the promise that service could exist without sacrifice of personal dignity. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the harbor's surface, Lydia found herself considering for the first time in years that perhaps her story in uniform hadn't ended. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right conditions to continue. The following morning brought a different energy to Hangar 3B, as palpable as the shift in barometric pressure that preceded significant weather changes. Word of the previous day's events had spread throughout the base with the efficiency of military communications networks, transforming Lydia from an object of ridicule into something approaching a legend. Personnel who had been present for the original humiliation found themselves part of a story that would be retold in military circles for years to come, while those who had missed the drama arrived for duty with the heightened awareness of people who knew something significant had happened in their absence. As Lydia walked through the main corridor leading to the technical areas, the transformation in her environment became immediately apparent. Personnel she passed offered respectful nods, rather than curious stares, their body language reflecting the deference typically reserved for officers or highly respected civilians. A few approached with genuine apologies for their earlier behavior, their words carrying the uncomfortable sincerity of people who had realized they'd participated in something shameful. Others simply watched with the curious attention reserved for someone whose story had exceeded their initial appearance. Their expressions mixing respect with the kind of fascination that came from witnessing unexpected revelations. The hangar itself seemed different, not in its physical structure, but in the way people moved through it. Conversations quieted when she passed, not from discomfort but from acknowledgement. Equipment operators paused their work to offer greetings that recognized her expertise, rather than questioned her presence. The atmosphere had shifted from skeptical tolerance to genuine welcome, creating an environment where her knowledge could contribute rather than defend itself. Evan Porter waited near the diagnostic equipment where he'd first recognized the significance of her patch. His positioning was deliberate, close enough to the main traffic flow to intercept her arrival, but distant enough from other personnel to allow for private conversation. When he saw her approaching, he straightened with the bearing of someone who had news to deliver, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal relief. "Mrs. Marston," he said as she reached his station, his voice carrying the carefully modulated tone of someone who had spent considerable time preparing his words. "I wanted you to know, I've been working with the base systems people to sort out your access issues." He held up a new identification card, its surface gleaming with updated security features that caught the hangar's fluorescent lighting like a small beacon. The card bore holographic elements that shifted as he moved it, indicating security clearances that went far beyond standard contractor access. Her photograph looked back at her from the plastic surface, but everything else about the documentation reflected her actual status, rather than the temporary contractor designation she'd been carrying. "Admiral Maddox authorized a complete revision of your credentials," Porter explained, his satisfaction evident in both his voice and posture. "Full consultant access with security clearances appropriate to your background. Database flags have been updated to prevent future system conflicts. No more error messages, no more questions about authorization, no more computers treating you like an intruder in your own professional space." Lydia accepted the card, examining the updated information that officially restored her professional identity after years of unofficial exile from military service. The weight of the card was negligible, but its significance felt substantial, tangible proof that recognition could translate into practical changes that affected daily experience. "I also wanted to apologize," Porter continued, his expression becoming more serious as he addressed the personal aspects of the previous day's events. "I recognized that patch yesterday morning, but I should have said something immediately. My silence contributed to what you had to endure. And that's something I'll have to live with." "You did what you could," Lydia replied, her voice carrying the measured understanding of someone who had learned to evaluate actions within their proper contexts. "Recognition isn't always immediate, and you followed proper protocols when you understood what you were seeing. Sometimes institutional systems create situations where individuals can't act as quickly as they'd like." Porter nodded, but his expression suggested he remained uncomfortable with his role in the previous day's events. The conversation represented more than professional courtesy. It was part of a larger process of reconciliation that would take time to complete fully. "If you're planning to work with us going forward," he said, "I want you to know you'll have my full support. There are projects here that could benefit from someone with your background, communication redundancy systems that need updating, protocol development that requires both technical expertise and operational understanding, real work that matches your capabilities." Their conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps that carried the measured cadence of someone walking with deliberate purpose. Sergeant Heller appeared around a bank of equipment, moving with the careful bearing of someone who had spent considerable time reflecting on his behavior. His uniform was immaculate, his posture correct, but his expression carried the weight of genuine remorse rather than mere military discipline. When he reached them, he addressed Lydia directly, his voice carrying none of the theatrical authority that had characterized his earlier interactions. "Ma'am, I wanted to follow up on yesterday's apology. I've been thinking about what happened, and I realize the public apology was just the beginning of making this right." He handed her a written document, several pages of official paperwork bearing multiple signatures and departmental seals. The formatting identified it as a formal report submitted through proper channels, its language carrying the precision required for documents that would become part of permanent records. "This is a formal incident report I submitted to my commanding officer," he explained, his voice maintaining the respectful tone of someone who understood the gravity of his actions. It details my errors in judgment, analyzes the systemic factors that contributed to the situation, and recommends changes to personnel procedures that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Lydia scanned through the document. Noting its thoroughness and evident sincerity, the report didn't minimize his responsibility or attempt to distribute blame to others. Instead, it provided a clear analysis of how assumptions had led to inappropriate actions and what changes in training and procedure might prevent similar failures of recognition in the future. I've also requested additional training in recognizing classified personnel and understanding security protocols, he added, his commitment extending beyond mere acknowledgement to practical steps for improvement. What happened yesterday was inexcusable, and I want to make sure it never happens again, not just for me, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar position. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of someone who had genuinely learned from his mistakes rather than simply enduring the consequences of them. Lydia read through the report more carefully, noting recommendations that would benefit other veterans who might find themselves in similar situations. I appreciate this, Sergeant, she said, returning the document to him after her review. Learning from mistakes is what matters most. Sometimes the most valuable education comes from recognizing when our assumptions were wrong. As Heller departed, walking with the relieved posture of someone who had completed a difficult but necessary task, Porter watched him go with an expression of grudging respect. He's been genuinely shaken by this, he observed. I think yesterday taught him something important about the difference between judgment and understanding. The morning continued with Lydia settling into work that matched her actual capabilities, rather than the limitations everyone had assumed. Personnel who approached her now did so with questions that recognized her expertise, seeking her input on technical problems that had been puzzling them for weeks. The diagnostic equipment responded to her commands without authorization delays, and the complex systems she reviewed revealed their secrets to someone who understood their underlying principles. Near the end of the day, she found herself again at the diagnostic panels where her patch had first been recognized. The screens displayed the same complex data streams they'd shown 24 hours earlier: telemetry readings, system status reports, communication protocol analyses. But everything else had changed. Her position in the environment, the way others saw her contribution, and, most importantly, her own sense of belonging in a space she'd thought she'd lost the right to occupy. Admiral Maddox appeared as she was finishing her review of the day's technical work. His arrival announced by the same measured footsteps that had transformed the previous day's humiliation into vindication. "How was your first official day back?" he asked, his question carrying genuine interest rather than mere courtesy. "Different," she replied simply, the word encompassing changes that went far beyond modified access credentials. "Better. I'm glad to hear it." He paused, studying her expression with the attention of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of psychological well-being in personnel under his command. "Have you given any thought to the consulting position we discussed?" Lydia looked around the hangar, observing the personnel who now treated her presence as valuable rather than questionable, the equipment that responded to her expertise rather than rejecting her credentials, the environment that had been transformed by nothing more than the revelation of truth. The change was profound but also fragile, dependent on continued recognition rather than assumption, requiring ongoing commitment to seeing people as they actually were rather than as they initially appeared. "Yes," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found solid ground after years of uncertainty. "I think I'm ready to try again." Maddox smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him since his dramatic entrance the previous day. "Welcome back, Specialist Marston. I think you'll find this tour of duty considerably more satisfying than your last." As the hangar lights dimmed for the evening shift change, Lydia walked toward the main exit with the measured pace of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Her footsteps echoed with a different rhythm than they had the morning before. Not the hurried, nervous steps of someone trying to avoid attention, but the confident stride of someone who had earned her place and knew it would be respected. In her pocket, both the old coin and the new one rested together, reminders of service given, recognition earned, and the possibility that some stories of disappearance were actually stories of return. The old coin bore the scratches and wear of years spent hidden, while the new one gleamed with official acknowledgement. But together, they represented the complete arc of a career that had survived judgment, exile, and ultimate vindication. Behind her, the diagnostic panels continued their endless monitoring of systems that kept aircraft flying and communications flowing, maintained by people whose own stories remained largely invisible until circumstances demanded they be seen. The equipment hummed with electronic purpose, processing data streams that connected the base to operations around the world, creating networks of information that enabled missions she would never know about but had helped make possible. Outside the hangar, the evening sun painted the base in shades of gold and amber, illuminating a world where recognition, once given, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of who among them deserved respect. The harbor stretched beyond the base boundaries, its waters reflecting the sky's colors, while supporting vessels that carried the nation's purposes to distant shores. Sometimes, as Lydia had learned, all you really need is to be seen, the courage to wear your service with quiet dignity, even when others can't recognize its value, creates the foundation for moments when truth finally reveals itself, and transforms judgment into understanding. Would you like another story?